Hello, folks. Welcome back to another compilation of listener-submitted stories. As the summer season begins to wind down, I thought now would be a good time to share some of these strange experiences with you, most of which occurred in the last few months. So let's begin. Story 1. A few summers ago, I was out camping inside Porcupine Mountain State Park in Pierre, Michigan. It's a stunning slice of paradise, and I had been to this area half a dozen times over the years. There are over 60,000 acres to explore, with all kinds of sights and hikes for all types. The park offers scenic waterfalls, miles of interior hiking, lodging, swimming, and mountaineering. I found a sweet little spot to hunker down for a couple of days on a ledge with a gorgeous view of the porcupines. It was one of the many hidden gems inside the park, and there was no issue of privacy, for you could have as much of it as you wanted, for as long as you wanted it for. It was just me in my little tent, perched up there on that ledge, overlooking miles of pristine forest. My truck was parked in a secluded lot a couple of miles away, and the hike out here was easy and pleasant. The first night was amazing, and I slept like a baby. That morning kicked off with a campfire breakfast, bacon, eggs, and toast, washed down with a strong cup of joe. I filled my day with small hikes and took a refreshing dip in a nearby spring. I enjoyed a hearty baked potato for dinner and played my guitar until the sun went down. I was asleep soon thereafter. In the middle of the night, a strong breeze pushed in the walls of my tent, waking me from a sound sleep. In a daze, I realized I could also hear the sliding of rock and dirt around my campsite, and I knew it wasn't wind after all. There was somebody out there. My first thoughts were that of anger from being awoken and disturbed all the way out here in the middle of nowhere. I made an extra effort to ensure I was alone and as far away from anyone else as I could be. So how did they find me? I called out with a stern warning, as I was also armed, but nothing. I peered out the entrance of the tent with my flashlight in one hand and the gun in the other. Nothing but dark forest. I slowly and cautiously examined the perimeter for what seemed like an hour, hoping to find the source of that movement, but I was only met with silence. Probably just a curious animal looking for food or something, I thought. I remember looking at the night sky and thinking how beautiful it was. A jet black canopy, freckled with diamonds. The air was warm, and a slight breeze blew upward from the valley below. But then behind me, I heard my tent crinkle, and turned around in time to see the thing fold in half, then shoot off the cliff, with everything still inside. I raced over, but it was too late. The tent skirted down the cliff wall before free-falling into darkness. But the real problem wasn't losing my tent, but also everything that was inside. My food and water, along with all my camping gear and supplies, even the damn keys to my truck. Everything was in there. And if I really wanted it back, I'd have to descend hundreds of feet down, but the risk for injury would be too high. Now, with all this in mind, what the hell happened? What could have done such a thing? My tent was secured and anchored down tightly against the earth, and it would take some kind of serious force to uproot it and toss it the way it did. It would probably take hurricane-like winds to pull it off, but the air was still as the surrounding grass. Something pulled my tent off that cliff, and whatever had awoken me just might have saved my life, now that I think about it. Thank God I still had a spare key in the hood of my truck. I had my boots on too, and I could use my flashlight to navigate safely through the woods and back to the road. So I made the decision to abandon what was left of my campsite and made my way back toward the truck, which I eventually did. But the entire way back though, I was being followed, no doubt about it. I think my gun was the only thing keeping them or it at a good distance, as it was just always out of sight. My eyes never left that trail, and even when I returned to the truck and drove off, I always kept a watchful eye in the rear view. It could have been anything that had harassed me out there, but my senses tell me it wasn't a person. That's all I have for you. Thank you. Story 2. On a beautiful June afternoon, I set out to hike the whopping 1/2 mile Bright Angel Point Trail, a self-guided nature trail which offers a pretty spectacular view of the canyon, 3,000 feet below the rim. The kind of spot sure to rake in the crowds, myself included. Well, that afternoon was nothing special. I made the 30-minute trek out there and was met with an average-sized crowd of about a dozen or so. Well, lucky for me, they were all in one group and were on their way out as I was setting in. A few minutes later, the last of them took some snapshots and headed back toward the trailhead. Now it was just myself and the very view I set out to see. At this point, it was 5:30, and the setting sun began to paint the canyon in vibrant colors of orange and red. A gentle breeze tugged at me from the north, and I could hear the distant rush of water from the roaring springs below. But the next sound I heard was a light popping sound. It was the sound of something falling on the earth right next to me. There on the ground to my left sat an old purple water bottle, and it was sun-bleached by what looked like years of being out in the elements. It was also empty. I don't remember seeing it before now, but then again I wasn't really paying attention. I wasn't sure if this was the source of that popping sound I heard, but I left alone and continued gazing at the landscape. But a moment later, I heard it again, and this time I turned to see that same water bottle rocking back and forth, like somebody had just dropped it again. Now this got my attention, but I convinced myself it was the breeze cycling it around, but that was until I began walking back. I noticed it rolling up behind me. The strange thing was, it seemed to be following my exact footpath. When I moved forward, it rolled from its place in my direction. I couldn't explain it, but it gave me a bit of a chill. Well, as I disappeared back onto the main trail, I could still hear it rolling forward, even though it was now out of view. It was like it was trying to catch up to me, and it was like this for the next moment or so. There was the occasional breeze that stirred up, given it blew the exact opposite direction, but something told me something else was responsible for moving that water bottle. Story 3. Over the years, I've heard some pretty strange stories coming out of Yosemite National Park. Well, here's one more I wanted to add to the list. Unlike the strange cryptid sightings, weather phenomenon, and even the unusual missing person cases that pop up from time to time inside the park, this experience is one of a kind, at least to my knowledge. In May of this year, I had hiked several trails within the Pine Valley region of the park, one of them being the Cottonwood Creek Trail. It's a short but sweet hike with low to moderate foot traffic, and very family-friendly. I prefer to stay away from the larger crowds at some of the more prominent locations, like Yosemite Valley, Panorama Trail, and Half Dome. But these little side trails are totally underrated and have a lot to offer, just for your information. So there I was on a solo hike halfway through the trail when I spotted a baby deer about 20 yards away, slightly off the trail and grazing on a cluster of weeds at the end of a thick black cottonwood forest. I had seen a lot of deer during my time out in these areas, but I never got tired of watching them in their natural habitat. So I watched this one for a bit, but I didn't see the mother, but as soon as she was nearby, as they usually are. But in the snap of a twig, the fawn froze and peered off in the opposite direction of where I was standing. I tried to see what it was looking at, but couldn't get a clean view of anything except the forest. But then there was a loud cracking that emanated from where the fawn was, and in a split second, something enveloped the poor thing. A quick struggle followed, then all was quiet. I took cover behind another group of trees and peered back at the scene in time to see a very strange thing happening. The deer was gone now, but my attention was directed off to a tree that the deer was standing next to. It was a black cottonwood tree, and it was expanding and retracting, pulsating several times before resting in a natural position. The cracking also stopped. Did I just witness a tree swallowing a baby deer? After a moment of disbelief, I slowly approached the tree. I could see no sign that it had opened up. Yet somehow, the animal disappeared inside of it. How does one explain this? Is there something sinister about black cottonwoods that we just don't know about? Have they somehow evolved to ingest living creatures, like that of a Venus flytrap? Was something else disguised as one of those trees? This whole experience left me with a landslide of questions. Story 4. Hello, Rusty. This experience isn't as spooky as it is strange. Some might say it's more of a blessing than a curse, and the more it happens, the more I have to agree. For as long as I can remember, something always seems to happen when I enter the wilderness. The first thing I noticed is there are virtually no people where I end up going. And when I do arrive at areas that do have them, they tend to disperse and disappear. I could be in a well-traveled trail or a touristy area, and for some reason they sorta just clear the room, so to speak. No, I'm not physically intimidating by any means. In fact, just the opposite. I'm a smaller guy who wears glasses, and in my early 60s. You know, the kind of guy most likely to be picked on in school. And I was. But people always seem to distance themselves from me out there. I didn't notice it so much in the city, but it was like this every time I went outdoors. Most recently, I was hiking out in Joshua Tree, Mount Baldy, and the Devil's Punch Bowl. Sometimes I hike solo, other times with my hiking buddy. But I was solo during the hikes I just mentioned. And each time I hit the trail, I found myself completely alone, every damn time. I suppose I should just appreciate the peace and tranquility of it, and I do. But I'm always left with the weird feeling that I'm not really as alone as I think I am. When I was hiking in Joshua Tree, there was a hell of a crowd that had gathered there when I arrived, and when I did so on that particularly beautiful, warm, sunny day, they all just sort of left, and within a short time. At Baldy, same thing happened. The weather did some weird stuff too, like going from gusty to completely still, and from overcast to a beaming blue sky within minutes. But the weirdest one was feeling the need to remove my shoes and shed my clothes. Maybe it was the hippie in me, but logic would never allow me to pull off such a stupid stunt like that out there. But the strangest experience was 2 years ago during my time at Zion. I had been on a guided tour around the Zion Canyons following a group of senior citizens. I was last in line, but for some reason I could never quite catch up to them. I was in the best physical shape of all of them, too. But it was like for every step I took, they took 5. The space between me and the other hikers ahead just kept growing, like a scene from a horror movie where the hallway stretches out before the camera. It felt like the trail had somehow warped itself to keep me separate from the rest of the group. It was during this experience I felt a darkness, like the wilderness wanted to take me. Again, I was consumed by the need to shed my clothes. I just thought I'd share that I don't take any drugs, use any pharmaceuticals, or have any known medical issues. I don't know what to make from any of this, but I'm convinced these areas are hiding a secret that only certain people like myself have access to. I don't really stand out at all. I look like your average Joe. Nothing special about me that I know of. So why are these things happening? Am I alone in this? I appreciate you telling my story. Thank you. Story 5. About a decade earlier, I was going through a pivotal time in my life. I was an addict and made some pretty poor choices surrounding that lifestyle. I hurt a lot of folks and did a lot of time because of it. But years later, I was invited to a safe and sober camping retreat out in the far reaches of Tennessee, and far away from anything that might tempt me to fall back into my old ways. I was with several others, whom also struggled with drug addiction. We all wanted to change our lives and figured what better way to recover than to be out in sweet Mother Nature. So the plan was to spend a couple weeks out there. Let's just say I only made it a few days before returning to the city. The camp was run by a group of drug addiction specialists and counselors. There were also 2 full-time security guards, which I thought was a little strange, considering we were all there on our own accord. The counselors told us they were there for preventative measures, whatever that meant. There were 6 cabins with 2 beds in each one, a total of 12 guests. The camp staff was quartered in the administration building a quarter-mile away from the rest of us, which was completely surrounded by miles of wild timber. It was a beautiful location, and we were all looking forward to spending some much-needed time away from everything. The first few days, we participated in group activities and discussions, went out for a long hike, followed by delicious home-cooked meals. At night, we gathered around the campfire, told jokes, and sang songs. Not a bad way to get back in tune with oneself. After a few days of this, our anxieties receded, and we can all feel the layers of our former selves being peeled back. I felt good for the first time in a long time. Friendships were blossoming, and serious progress was being made for each and every one of us. That was until the 4th night. One of the guests in the cabin overdosed on something and had to be taken out of the camp to a hospital. We were all shocked. We had a meeting the next day with mandatory searches and drug testing. Camp officials were baffled how the man could have obtained drugs way out here, and eventually theorized he snuck it in despite the rigorous security measures necessary to even enter the program. The following night, there were 2 more overdoses. Well, these 2 shared a cabin next to mine. Again, more searches and meetings with the threat of shutting down the camp with no refunds or reimbursements. And we paid good money to be there. It just didn't make sense to me why these men would go through all the trouble of being here only to use and even overdose. A couple of days later, one of the guests awoke to discover his bunkmate missing. So we all gathered together and split up to go look for him. About 15 to 20 minutes go by and we find him passed out in the woods, completely under the influence of something. The camp's administrative team showed up and escorted the man back to the bunk, where he remained under observation until he was well enough to speak. And what he told us was quite frightening. He said that in the middle of the night, a bear opened the front door of his cabin and looked inside. His bunkmate was still sound asleep, but he was wide awake, frozen in place. The next thing he remembered was being carried over the shoulder of the beast. Now these are his exact words. Quote, "After we stared at each other for what seemed like a minute, everything got fuzzy, and I passed out. That's when I woke to find my weak and limp body slung over the shoulder of this animal. It was dark, and I could feel the branches of trees clawing at us as we galloped into the deep forest. The thing was now running with me, secured tightly in its leathery and hairy grip. Everything went black, and I awoke the next morning, surrounded by camp staff." Well, after he explained his story over and over, everyone met for the last time to discuss the issue. We tossed around a few theories and figured the best one was that of drugs itself, and that the man had hallucinated or someone was going around drugging guests. That itself was good reason to shut down camp operations and get the hell out of Dodge. Though I was curious about one thing that kept circling my thoughts like a shark. What kind of drug were these men on? The symptoms were different, and I didn't recognize them. And believe me, I would know, as I've done almost every kind of drug there is out there. We were never given a solid answer from officials, but one of the camp counselors eventually leaked it to me, and said that it was GHB, a common date rape drug. But these men weren't raped. They weren't robbed either. I don't know. You tell me what happened. We'll probably never know what happened out there exactly, but my days of drug use are most definitely long gone. Peace and be well, everyone. And there you have it. Next time you find yourselves in the great outdoors, you may want to consider these experiences while doing so. You can never be too prepared out there, so get out and enjoy the rest of the season. But be safe in doing so, and you'll hear from me soon.